It's been almost 2 years now since Syria's Arab Spring began. It has become the bloodiest revolution, turning quickly into a civil war, no end in sight. 70,000 people, most of them civilians, have been killed as the world, in large part, looks the other way. Many of the rebel groups in Syria feel completely abandoned. Now word that Saudi Arabia is stepping up support for Syrian rebels, supplying them with weapons. According to American and Western officials, they recently financed, the Saudis, a large purchase of weapons from Croatia and are funneling them to rebels in Syria. Ex-Yugoslav military equipment we're talking about here. Let's go to Michael Rubin in Washington. He's a former Pentagon official and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Michael, what do you make of what Saudi Arabia is apparently doing here, supplying the rebels?
Well, Todd, the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Turks have made no secret of the fact that they want Bashar al-Assad to fall, and they also have made no secret of the fact that they think that the Syrian rebels should have weaponry. What they will say is the Iranians are supporting Bashar al-Assad and the government forces which are fighting the rebels. So simply to put an arms embargo on Syria would be a kiss of death for the Syrian fighters.
Up till now, Michael, as you know, we were talking about arms shipments being things like AK-47s, Kalashnikov, small arms fire, that type of stuff. This type of stuff, though, from Croatia is, more heavy artillery, anti-aircraft stuff. I mean, can this help the rebels to compete against Assad's troops, who are in many cases being supplied by the Iranians and the Russians?
Well, certainly it can. Look, the fact that these weapons are coming from Croatia shouldn't be a surprise. Every conflict zone is the arms market for a future conflict. When it comes to the greater sophistication of the weaponry, over the last couple of weeks we've been seeing videos on jihadist forums and so forth of Syrian helicopters and airplanes being shot down. Certainly there needs to be some weaponry to enable them to do that. The question was whether this weaponry was being captured from Syrian forces, for example, when the rebels overran an Air Force base, or whether it was coming in from the outside. Now the question to that seems to be answered.
Michael, one of the things the U.S. government has said about why they don't want to arm the rebels is they're worried that the jihadists are going to get a hold of some of these weapons. How can we be sure that some of this heavier weaponry from Croatia is not falling into the hands of some of the more extremist groups in Syria?
We absolutely can't be sure that it's not. We see this time and time again, this idea of blowback. When Libya fell, much of the weaponry which the Libyans lost track of ended up in Mali and helped fuel that conflict. Right now, we're seeing a great deal of weaponry fall into the hands of the Syrian rebels, and not just the ordinary Syrian rebels. We've seen a steady radicalization of the Syrian rebel groups as a lot of the liberals either flee or are killed. Certainly, what this also means is that in the future, the Syrian civil war is going to be far from over. It's not going to end with Bashar al-Assad's death. You have multiple factions in the opposition now, and the most radical factions are increasingly becoming the best armed.
Michael, I want to show the viewers the cover of this week's Economist. It talks about Syria, and it basically says, the death of a country, and talking about how the rebels feel completely abandoned, the world not even paying any attention anymore. I mean, and going on to say that not doing anything is also a policy. What's your take on that?
Well, I certainly agree with that. By the more conservative estimates, you've already had 70,000 people at least killed over the last 2 years. But what those figures ignore is you have as many people who have simply disappeared. And let me assure you, people who disappear in Syria don't end up on vacation on the beach somewhere. They're probably in mass graves as well. And so the Syrians feel that the West has abandoned them, and therefore they're turning to the more radical elements. On top of which, we need to recognize that Syria today is far different than Syria 2 years ago. The violence hasn't been random. It's been conducted with a great degree of ethnic and sectarian cleansing, much like the Bosnia campaign was 20 years ago. And so when suddenly the smoke clears one day, Syria is going to look very much different, much like the former Yugoslavia, divided into cantons, some of which might end up, again, fighting each other.
Right, and much of civil society destroyed. What should Washington do? I mean, there was all this buzz a week or so ago about how there was this plan to arm the rebels, and the White House decided not to go ahead with that against some of the advice of their top advisors. What should Washington do, Michael?
Well, there's this fantasy in Washington that all options are always on the table when the reality of the matter is, as time continues, the options which are available to policymakers to extract a reasonable solution dwindle down to nothing. And I'm afraid to say right now, and I'm going to sound quite pessimistic, there are no more good options left. We're going to be talking about containing the violence in Syria rather than ending it for years to come.
I appreciate your insights, Michael. Great conversation. Michael Rubin with the American Enterprise Institute, joining us from Washington with the latest.